The 14th BRICS summit is going to begin from tomorrow. The Chinese President Xi Jinping will address the meeting in a virtual mode. The meeting is, by the way, taking place in the virtual mode. And the theme of the meeting is foster high quality BRICS partnership, usher in a new era of global development. The BRICS summit, we know that it's a partnership, it's a bloc for the emerging economies and the developing countries. And there is a sort of commentary where the theme of the meeting is stated to be combating global hunger and reducing poverty. Ambassador Sinha, how do you see the virtual meeting of the 14th BRICS summit, that too in the context of the Europe war that is taking place between Russia and Ukraine, and at the same time, the consequent global economic disruption that the world is facing right now?
Thank you, Manish, for having me. BRICS has had a very unusual origin. As you know, the idea of BRICS was conceived not as a group of countries, but it was merely an identification of some economies in the world which held the promise of becoming major economies that could participate in the international economy. And this identification was done by a British economist who worked for Goldman Sachs. And he identified 4 countries at that time that held a great promise as emerging economies. The idea of converting this into a group of cross-regional consultations among leaders came from Russia 5 years later. And then it surprisingly picked up very well. It picked up as an idea of 4 countries at that time, and later South Africa was added as the 5th country, as a group of countries that were different from the Western economies and that offered an alternative model of development and cooperation, and which were prepared to cooperate with each other in helping other countries that were not among the advanced economies of the world to develop themselves. So it became a forum for cross-regional consultations. It offered an alternative model of development, and it offered development assistance to countries. So as part of the progress that was made by BRICS, it set up the new development bank and it set up a contingent reserve fund. The bank has been doing reasonably well. But over the years, as you mentioned, certain developments have taken place that have changed the dynamic of the global order as it existed when Jim O'Neill first conceived of this group of 4 countries. And that comes from the fact that first was the global financial crisis that took place in 2008-2009, and then China's rise, and now you have the Ukraine war, which has polarized the world and brought back the Cold War in its full form. So BRICS has become a kind of a group which is now struggling to find its role that it had originally had been conceived for it and its leaders had imagined. Because for India, BRICS was an expression of multipolarity, which is one of the things that we have always wanted, especially when BRICS was conceived 20 years ago. That was the period of the orthodoxy of market fundamentalism and the dominance of one system and one country in the world. So India was very keen to develop a multipolar world. Today, the situation is quite different. And in this, India is now balancing its relations with both groups and chalking out its own course forward through bilateral cooperation with individual countries, especially by signing the FTAs with countries like the UAE and Australia, and now negotiating with the EU and the UK. But at the same time, BRICS retains its relevance as a cross-regional consultative forum where countries that are there from different continents come together and discuss the global system and offer the world the possibility of reconciliation and moving forward together rather than in a bipolar setting. Now, whether that is possible or not, only time can tell. But the effort is certainly being made. It's not going to be easy in this highly polarized atmosphere.
Indeed, Ambassador Sinha, you have rightly summarized the context. But right now, the principal challenge to the global economy appears to be the energy crisis. And we have seen that China has become the largest importer of oil from Russia, and India is also importing oil from Russia in big quantity, and alternative arrangement for the trade is being deployed. In the context of the American-led sanctions against Russia and the way Russia does it, How do you think that the BRICS would be navigating to a situation where its developmental needs are addressed, principally the energy needs?
For India's relations with Russia are not in the same league as China's relations. China has actually supported Russia in its invasion of Ukraine, and it has strengthened its relations with Russia, and China has now emerged as the largest buyer of Russian oil. In the case of India, our purchases of oil from Russia have increased, but they are minuscule both for Russia and for India, and of very little importance in terms of the importance that the oil exports of Russia have today in the world. So in this context, the important thing for India is not necessarily to look at BRICS as the only forum. In fact, India, as you would have noticed, has joined the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that's been proposed by the US recently at the Quad Summit in Tokyo. So India is clearly positioning itself in a manner in which it is putting its own national interests first and keeping its options open, and also ensuring that its relations with neither side get affected by the Ukraine war. But it does not support the war effort in any case, and it's not supporting Russia's invasion. So on that count, there's a clear distinction between the position of China and India. Now, whether India will be able to influence the behavior of Russia and China in the framework of BRICS to be able to moderate their position and perhaps reduce the tensions of the new Cold War that is taking place in the world today. One does not know. One hopes that such efforts will succeed. But the fact remains that today, China, as you mentioned, is the dominant economy of the world. And China, in fact, is investing much more through its Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which it set up around the same time as the New Development Bank of BRICS. And China's investment in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is higher than in the New Development Bank, which incidentally is also based in Shanghai. So for China, the priority is its own bilateral development assistance rather than using BRICS. And for India, as I mentioned earlier, the priority is to move forward with its own FTAs and its partnership in the IPEF. So one has to see how BRICS shapes up in the months coming ahead, because it clearly is going through a situation where the global order is a lot different from the one in which it was conceived.
Ambassador Sinha, I would like to draw your attention to a couple of things. In late March, the Chinese foreign minister had come to India, and the Indian foreign minister, S. Jaishankar, had done a lot of plain speaking to him in the context of the Chinese army camping across the line of actual control in Ladakh. And we had, in fact, suggested that the ties between India and China cannot be normal if there is tension on the border. That is one thing. And second is that India's key positioning in Indo-Pacific Quads, which we have seen in the Quad Summit at Tokyo, and now India would be taking in another sort of a Quad with Israel and UAE and the US. Now, there is an attempt on the part of China to portray this 14th BRICS Summit to convey a sort of message to the West. So do you think that India will need to be cautious to China's posturing at this summit?
Yes, I entirely agree with you that India needs to be extremely conscious about the kind of image that China projects of this BRICS summit that it is holding in China today. Of course, it's a virtual summit. The fact that India's bilateral relations with China are tense. China's behavior on the line of actual control has been anything but friendly. China's own relations with the neighbors of India through its economic policy of debt diplomacy has strained relations with these countries and also with India. And as I mentioned, if BRICS was an expectation of the rise of a multipolar world, then that certainly has been set aside by the fact that China itself has risen, and China looks upon itself now as a superpower, which is the leader of the second pole in this bipolar world. So in this kind of a situation, India has to be extremely careful in positioning itself within BRICS and re-examine its priorities in this area. Because if China is going to use BRICS to create its own group dominated by it, then clearly it does not meet the expectations that we had of BRICS as a multipolar goal of a multipolar world. In this situation, the initiatives that we have taken in the Indo-Pacific are extremely important for us. So today, if we are looking at a balanced world in which there is less of power politics and more of international cooperation based upon national sovereignty, then one has to look at other forums and perhaps bilateral forums to promote that rather than with a forum that is sought to be dominated by China.
Ambassador Sinha, I would like you to have a quick comment on the BRICS, one of the mandates to seek reforms of the multilateral system. In the context of the World Trade Organization recently, in fact last week only, did accept demands of the developing countries on food grains and vaccine equity. Do you think that the BRICS indeed has some sort of relevance still to pursue reforms at the multilateral forums like the United Nations?
Well, BRICS had started with these ideas, but as far as the United Nations are concerned, there the answer is very simple. In the United Nations, the issue is the reform of the Security Council, where India wants a permanent seat, but the country blocking that most prominently is China. So BRICS certainly cannot be a forum for that. As far as WTO is concerned, an effort can be made in that direction, but we must remember that China is also a problem country in the WTO because China claims to continue with the status of a developing country, whereas it has become the world's second largest economy and the world's largest trading country. In this kind of an environment, China has to start taking more responsibilities as a major power rather than hide behind the facade of a developing country. And this issue came up in the recent WTO conference. That's a longer debate about how China conducted itself over there. But the fact remains that as far as the WTO is concerned, it's an organization that is in disarray at the moment. It has made modest progress in the last meeting that took place, but it needs to do a lot to strengthen and revive itself as the regulator of world trade.
Indeed, we will be keenly watching the 14th BRICS summit in which the Russian President Vladimir Putin will be taking part. Ambassador Sinha, you have given us a lot of insight. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Manish.